All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Grzegorz Zekiert. I'm a professor of government and director of the Center for European Studies. And I would really like to welcome all of you, both those in the room and those who join us remote, for the CES Democracy Seminar. And I welcome you on behalf of myself and Professor Daniel Ziblatt. We together are chairing that seminar. The seminar is a joint venture between CES and a couple of other institutes. And these are the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, Democracy Institute at the Central European University, Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, and Center for the Study of Democracy, Civil Society, and Political Elites at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. And we are delighted that our colleagues are joining us for this event. Our focus today is on one of the most important academic ventures in recent years, namely the creation of the comprehensive new measures of various aspects of democracy, which then can be used and allow disciplined research in historical political science and sociology. Of course, you all know the venture, it's V-Dem Institute. And we have a great opportunity to present today two scholars who were with V-Dem since its founding and will present some conclusions from the recent book, Varieties of Democracy, Measuring 2 Centuries of Political Change. After the presentations by Michael Koppenach and Michael Bernhardt, we will have our esteemed colleague Pippa Norris joining us and offering some comments. Let me very briefly introduce our speakers. Michael Bernhardt is the inaugural holder of Raymond and Miriam Ehrlich Eminent Scholar Chair in Political Science at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and is about to be hit by a 5-degree hurricane, which is sort of a few miles away from his home. Michael is editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics and has been working for many years on issues and questions of democratization, civil society, institutional choices in new democracies, legacy of various forms of dictatorship. Michael published several books and many papers. Let me just mention his book on collective political memory, 20 years after communism, which he co-edited, Institutions and Fate of Democracy, comparing Germany and Poland, and the origin of democratization in Poland. Michael Koppenach is professor of political science at University of Notre Dame and faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Michael was the principal investigator for Variety of Democracy project. His research is pretty much in the same area as Michael's. Michael Bernhardt, democratization, political parties, and let me just mention a few books, Democratization and Research Methods from Cambridge University Press, Strong Parties and Lame Ducks, and of course the book which we are focusing on today, A Variety of Democracy Measuring 2 Centuries of Political Change. And finally, Pippa Norris is the Paul McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and faculty affiliates of the Department of Government. Pippa really does not need introduction. She is an amazing scholar. She published around 50 books. And her research ones are Price of Skepticism, 2022, Cultural Backlash with Ron Inglehart, Strengthening Electoral Integrity, So we are grateful to both Michaels and to Pipa for joining us for this seminar. So we'll start with the presentation with Michael Kopacz, please.
Thank you very much, Georgia, for very kind introduction. I do want to clarify that I'm one of 4 or 5 principal investigators. So V-Dem, not the principal investigator for it. But anyway, we were in, Mike Bernard and I were invited to talk about the final chapter, chapter 8 of the new book, Why Democracies Develop and Decline, and also to talk about the V-Dem data, the V-Dem project. So this conclusion that I'm going to be talking about is the conclusion to a very big picture book. Although it's an edited book, it's a very cohesive book. It's almost like it's written by a single person or co-authored by all of us, because all of the lead authors of each of the chapters are part of the V-Dem project, and we've worked together for more than 10 years. And yet each chapter is innovative in its own ways. We had a division of labor setting out with this. The main project was to retest all the major hypotheses about the causes of democratization using our new data. And so we had a division of labor where we have some descriptive trends. John Gehring looks at geography and demography. I have a chapter that looks at international influences. Karl-Henrik Knudsen and Sirian Dahlem look at economic determinants. Alan Hicken looks at institutions with a couple of co-authors. Michael Bernard and Amanda Edgell look at social forces, and I'm going to be talking about the last chapter, which is co-authored with Karl-Henrik and Sven-Erik Skaaning and Staffan Lindberg. And I want to have a little disclaimer to say what I'm going to be talking about are conclusions about mean effects that are assumed to be uniform over a very large sample of about 150 countries for more than 100 years. So, you know, if we focused on particular regions or particular countries or particular historical periods, the conclusions would be somewhat different. But we thought we would start with a big picture, and then later on, we or others could look at more specific relationships. And so each of the preceding chapters tested some variables that all belong to different schools of thought. And then in this chapter, we're taking the best findings from those chapters and trying to integrate them into a single overarching framework. This chapter is more than just a summary of what came of the findings from the preceding chapters, and it's more than just a tournament of variables. It also does some original things. It poses some additional puzzles. It develops a different theoretical framework. And third, it uses a different modeling method. So about the additional puzzles, there are 3 of them. One is, why is there more variance in electoral democracy, which we also call polyarchy, more variance between countries than within countries? And the between country variance is about 55% of the variance in this big global sample. And the variance within countries is only about a quarter. A second puzzle is, why are there so many unresolved debates in the democratization literature over the many decades driven by findings that are not robust? People find different things. And the third big question is, why does democratization and breakdown follow a pattern of punctuated equilibrium? I'm going to talk about each one of those things. So the theoretical framework, there are 5 things I want to say about the theoretical framework. First is that we think it's important to distinguish among 3 different outcomes. One is the levels of democracy, which we measure with the Electoral Democracy Index from V-Dem. Another one are the positive changes in electoral democracy, which we call upturns. And the third one are the negative changes, year-to-year changes in democracy, which we call downturns. And we adopt these outcomes from Jan Theorel's 2010 book. A second aspect of the framework is that for each one of these outcomes, we argue that there's a causal sequence that is composed of a different mix of 4 different kinds of variables. At one extreme, there are distal variables, variables that took on their values in a pre-modern democratic age and have changed very little, if at all. At the other extreme, there are very proximate variables, variables that take on their current values very recently. They tend to change a lot. They're dynamic. And in between, there are two kinds of intermediate variables. There are distinct intermediate variables that tend to change in an incremental way, and are things that are conceptually different from democracy. And then there are also similar intermediate variables, which tend to change episodically, and they're conceptually sort of on the periphery of what democracy is. And these things play a different role in explaining these three different outcomes. In order to kind of approximate the idea of causal distance, I wanted to demonstrate that. So if you take the major variables that we look at in this chapter and regress them on their values 10 years before, you get an estimate of how much they change by decade. And at the high extreme, things that are demographic or geographic variables tend to be very, very similar from their values 10 years before. So Protestant or Muslim population, mean temperature, ethnic fractionalization, European population percentage, things like that are nearly fixed. At the other extreme, at the bottom of this chart, you find things that change very rapidly. So things like civil society movement campaigns that can rise and fall over every year or over a course of a few years. And there are also things like economic growth and things like that that are also very dynamic. And in between, you have a lot of intermediate variables. And so levels of polyarchy have a temporal dependence or inertia that's somewhere between half and 3/4 of the variance, whereas the upturns and downturns are very dynamic. And so they're better explained by the more dynamic proximate variables, and levels of democracy are sort of in the middle. So they're well explained in part by the dynamic variables and part by the intermediate and distal variables. A third aspect of the theoretical framework is that we talk about a punctuated equilibrium. That is, that there are long periods of relative stability interrupted by sudden large changes. That's the tendency. There are a few countries that have democratized very slowly and gradually over a long period of time, like South Korea, but in large part, a lot of changes have been kind of sudden and dramatic. A fourth part of the framework is that there are periods of equilibrium because some of the causes, especially of levels of democracy, are static or slowly changing, and many of these causes are mutually reinforcing. They tend to reinforce each other and maintain a certain level, a phenomenon called homeostasis. But it's a punctuated equilibrium because it can be upset by more dynamic proximate causes, or even by some gradual changes that reach a tipping point at a certain point, and then there can be a dramatic change. So if this framework is correct, then there are implications for how we should model that when we're trying to study it. The distal variables are more likely to be exogenous, and other variables are more likely to be endogenous. They're both causes and effects. But if we put all the variables in the same model and assume that they're all exogenous, which is what most people have done looking at this phenomenon, then the more proximate variables tend to eclipse the more distal variables. And this is one of the reasons that findings haven't been robust. I think it's important that if we think there are endogenous relationships, then they need to be modeled appropriately, rather than just choosing the distal variables or the proximate variables and modeling them separately. All of our variables are variables of interest, and we don't want the downstream variables to eclipse the upstream variables. So a demonstration of the importance of this. These are really simple models. These are not our final models, but in the top panel, there are several distal variables like demographic and geographic information. And if in model 1, some of these are significant and they explain about half of the variance. If you add some distinct intermediate variables in the center panel, then some of them are significant and they drive out the significance of at least one of the others. But if you add in the similar intermediate variables along with the other two groups, then all of the similar intermediate variables are statistically significant and none of the others are significant any longer, as they come later in the causal chain and they eclipse the effect of the other variables. So the technique that this chapter uses to study these relationships is path analysis. And one of the benefits of path analysis are that it's an appropriate technique for endogeneity, but the drawback, the biggest drawback, and there are many, but the biggest drawback is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the model specification. Like, how do you know which variables are endogenous to which other variables? The way we dealt with that was that obviously first, the selection of which variables to put in the model was guided by the previous chapters here, which were based on decades of literature, looking at predictions. And secondly, we estimated what I'll call reasonably saturated models. If there were a saturated model, that would mean that every variable causes every other variable, but you can't estimate a model like that. So we imposed certain restrictions to make it possible to estimate the model. First off, we said all the distal variables will be treated as exogenous. They are causes and not effects. And secondly, each endogenous variable has a 1-year lag of itself as an exogenous predictor. And third, the distal variables are not treated as direct causes of the dynamic outcomes of turns and downturns. But aside from that, it's pretty saturated. So there are many paths allowed between among all of the intermediate variables, and there are even feedbacks from polyarchy to some of these endogenous causes of polyarchy. And we report all of these paths in the tables of the book, but the path diagrams that I'm about to show you show only the statistically significant paths to make them a little more interpretable. This is still a little complex. I'm going to show you a series of 3 path diagrams to make it easier to read them. They all follow the same pattern. The first aspect of the pattern is that the outcome variable, whether it's polyarchy or upturns or downturns, that it's at the right side of the slide, in this case, polyarchy. Before that will be any dynamic proximate variables. And to the left of those will be any similar intermediate variables. And to the left of those will be the distinct intermediate variables. And at the very end will be the distal variables. Also,
just ask what CSO is.
CSO participatory environment means civil society organization participatory environment. So it's an easy interpretation is it's the vibrancy of civil society. Also, the lines between them, the solid lines are positive relationships. The dotted lines or dashed lines are negative relationships. And the width of the lines are roughly proportional to the standardized coefficients, although we report unstandardized coefficients in the tables as well. So now to walk through this, here's a key argument, is that it seems that there is a kind of protective belt of similar intermediate variables that affect levels of democracy. High state capacity, which you could also call the rule of law, institutionalized political parties, and vibrant civil society. You note that high state capacity and civil society both have a pretty strong direct impact on polyarchy. And institutionalized parties indirectly affect polyarchy through high state capacity and through some more complicated pathways as well. And these things reinforce one another, so that if one of these 3 factors tends to decline or falter, it can be bolstered by the other variables in the protective belt. And this is a process that can lead to a situation of homeostasis. So if a level of polyarchy is high and this protective belt also has high values, strong values, then they tend to maintain each other and maintain a high level of democracy. And if they're all very low, then they also tend to keep the country kind of stuck at a low level of democracy. It makes it difficult to change. And this is something that produces an equilibrium. At the same time, they are connected to the other variables. The intermediate variables, kind of the development variables like literacy, agricultural income, and GDP per capita are connected to these things as well. I will note that GDP per capita in this model has no direct impact on levels of polyarchy, but there are 5 more complex indirect paths through which GDP per capita does have an impact on polyarchy. Agricultural income in this model does have a negative impact on polyarchy. And then there are distal variables, European population, Protestant population, and resource dependence, like on oil, that indirectly affect things, and Protestant population in this model is estimated to directly impact polyarchy as well. So there's some complex relationships, many of them endogenous, that jointly combine to produce outcomes like polyarchy. And they all matter, but some have more direct impacts and some have indirect impacts. So there's a causal sequencing going on here. We think it's important to pay attention to the sequence of relationships and understanding the proper role that each one of these variables plays. If we change the outcome, this is now the outcome is the upturns, the positive changes in electoral democracy. And now there's some variables that are not in a shaded area: global economic growth, violent campaign, nonviolent campaign, and polyarchy itself, the level of electoral democracy. And three of these have direct impacts. The strongest one is polyarchy, which is a negative impact. And it's negative because if a country is already highly democratic, then it has nowhere to go but down. So the more democratic it is, the farther it tends to fall. That's kind of a control variable, but it's meaningful and important to take into account. Beyond that, a dynamic variable that matters a lot is the existence of nonviolent civil society campaigns. Global economic growth can have an impact as well. And then there's a similar intermediate variable: the vibrant civil society plays a really important role in explaining upturns. And then they're connected to other intermediate and distal variables as well. For downturns, which is now the ultimate variable, the outcome variable, we see that polyarchy also has a negative relationship here, meaning that the less democratic the system is, the less room it has to fall. And so the relationship is negative. But if the level of polyarchy is high, then it has more room to fall. So it's a larger negative effect. Anti-system movements also tend to increase the size of the downturns. And economic growth tends to dampen the downturns, as a positive impact there. And the civil society has an indirect impact that is significant, and so does state capacity or rule of law. The other things don't matter as directly. So, get to the point. In answering one of the initial questions, why are there so many unresolved debates in the literature driven by findings that are not robust? Well, this is far from the only reason, but if some researchers use distal variables and not proximate variables, then they're going to find that the distal variables are very important. If some people use proximate variables, either with or without distal variables, the proximate variables will look to be really important. They'll come to opposite conclusions. And it's really problematic that most people have treated all of these variables exogenous and have ignored the relationships among them. But the path models that respect this endogeneity help reduce the discordant conclusions, and we recommend that more people use that. Another one of the new questions is, why is there more variance between countries than within countries? Well, levels of democracy are sticky because this protective belt, rule of law, institutionalized parties, and the health of civil society, they form a protective belt and they're mutually reinforcing. And each of these variables tends to change slowly. And they are also dependent on some distinct intermediate development variables that tend to change only incrementally in the short term. And they also depend indirectly on more distal variables like geography and demography that are basically invariant. So that tends to produce a situation of homeostasis, an equilibrium. However, it's a punctuated equilibrium because there are more proximate dynamic variables like civil society campaigns and short-term economic growth and decline that disrupt the equilibrium. And so shrinking economies and anti-system and left-wing movements can provoke downturns. The Bernard and Edgell chapter also finds that right-wing movements can provoke downturns. And I tend to believe them, even though this chapter doesn't support that. And also growing economies and nonviolent civil society campaigns help make upturns possible. And also if there's sustained change in the development variables like per capita GDP and literacy, then that can undermine the protective belt or strengthen it and make successful transition to democracy sustainable or lead to a tipping point that promotes a breakdown. So overall, the modified understanding that this chapter proposes is that there are at least 3 different outcomes that are quite different and need to be explained in different ways. The more dynamic outcomes are explained by more proximate factors. The levels of democracy are explained better by the intermediate factors. And that there's this protective belt of institutions and organizations that are kind of on the periphery of democracy. Vibrant civil society is not necessarily part of democracy. The rule of law is not, at least the way we define it, although it would be part of a liberal democracy. And institutionalized political parties, probably necessary for democracy, but a little bit on the periphery. Anyway, they do a lot to preserve whatever level of democracy there is, or whether it's high or low. And GDP per capita, and this is maybe one of the findings of greatest interest, is that even though it's the most robust, although debated, predictor in the literature, we find it does matter for all 3 outcomes, but only indirectly. Doesn't have a direct effect on any of the 3 outcomes. And I do want to highlight that civil society activity and economic growth are the primary drivers of short-term changes, whether they're upturns or downturns, and specifically that nonviolent campaigns help and anti-system movements hurt. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the data. I'm going to start this, and then Michael Bernard is going to continue talking about the data, and I hope talking about civil society in more detail. And I just want to talk about the number of indicators. Like before V-Dem, this is a plot of 15 of the most influential, most used sources of data about democracy. And I put together this plot to show on the horizontal axis what years of history are covered by each measurement project. So there are more that start after 1950, but some go back as far as 1800, and there's greater coverage. There are more projects that cover things since about 1972, for example, Freedom House. The shading of the areas there denotes how many countries each project includes. So the darker shades cover all the countries, the lighter shades cover only certain regions. And then the vertical axis shows the number of indicators that are produced by the project. Most of these measurement projects produce 1 or 2 or a handful of different measures of democracy. I think the Democracy Barometer, another project, has about 70 or so indicators in it. So it really stands out from the other projects in that way, although it covers relatively few countries and only for relatively recent years. But V-Dem adds this in terms of the number of indicators and coverage. So the main V-Dem project goes from 1900 to the present, and it's updated every year now. And it has hundreds of indicators to measure just about everything you would be interested in finding out about democracy, and it covers almost every country in the world. And then historical V-Dem goes back to 1789 for a great number of countries. Admittedly, this book only begins to exploit the riches available in V-Dem data because we're primarily interested in using the electoral democracy index, but there's so much more that could be done to look at the four other varieties of democracy that we measure, as well as the hundreds of components and subcomponents of democracy. Any one of those things could become an outcome variable in this. And we decided we have to do this first, but then we or others later can get into more detail about that to drill down. So I'll hand it over to Michael Bernard now, and he'll discuss other aspects of the project.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. It was a great summary of the book, I have to say. So I'm going to talk about some ways in which the data project is unique. This is prodded by Grzegorz' question that wanted to know in what ways V-Dem is better than other major democracy data sets. I'm going to discuss this only in relation to the other sort of large N country year type data sets. I'm going to stay away from the behavioral data sets, which get individual data. They're somewhat different organisms. So I'm going to talk mostly in relation to Freedom House, Polity, Bertelsmann, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm more familiar with Freedom House and Polity because I've actually worked with them, and less so with Bertelsmann and the Economist Intelligence Unit. First thing, V-Dem from the onset has been free and easily available. Some data sets like Economist Intelligence Unit you have to pay for. Freedom House is hard to find on the web. There's no data link on their front page, and you have to like wade through the website to even find the spreadsheet that has all their data. Michael's talked about how comprehensive V-Dem's coverage is from 1789 to the present, better from 1900 to the present. The only comparable coverage in any of these data sets is Polity, which I believe goes from 1815 to the present. For Economist Intelligence Unit, it's only 2006 to the present. Bertelsmann only carries 137 countries, so there's no coverage of the older OECD countries because it's a transformational index. And it's only 2006 to the present, and the observation is only every 2 years. So V-Dem is far more comprehensive. I would also say that V-Dem is the most explicit about the methods that it derives its codings from, or its estimates. The methodology is much more explicit. One of the good things about V-Dem doing that is some of the other ones have now become more explicit about their methodology, so users know what they're dealing with. Michael has pointed out that it has the largest number of attributes of democracy or related to democracy of any data set. It's not only a democracy indicator, but for researchers, it's a treasure trove of independent and control variables, as you can see from some of the analyses that we did that Michael presented. I would argue that V-Dem also reflects the advances in the discipline in mixed methods. I'd say V-Dem in some ways brings a mixed methods mentality to the collection of large N data. Rather than bring a large N ethos to small N research, like some of your colleagues in the Harvard department have advocated, V-Dem sort of moves things in the other direction. So I think we brought some of the explicit methodological reading and comparative advantage of deep knowledge of place in a small N research to build a large N data set suitable for time series cross-sectional work. So let me, for instance, talk about this in one way. So V-Dem's variables are thickly conceptualized to take something that Michael advocated much earlier in his career. So, for instance, the dependent variable in the book is electoral democracy for most chapters. It's an interpretation of Dahl's polyarchy, and it brings together 5 thicker indices that capture participation, competition, and the legal guarantees that Dahl argues. And then we face the problem of aggregation, and again we've created a 5-way multiplicative interaction and a 5-way weighted average to put those two together to try and capture this. This is a much thicker way of thinking about how to define, how to conceptualize and operationalize democracy. And I would argue that this kind of operationalization is inspired more by, let's say, Sartori's view of the world and operationalization than Boland's. That is, Sartorian conceptualization, operationalization is based on some defining conditions that allow us to demarcate the reference from the surrounding phenomena and social reality. Of course, the more characteristics in the intention of a Sartorian definition, the more restrictive the extension. And I think in this way, V-Dem has allowed us to move forward and really try to avoid what Sartori would call cat-dog problems because of the added precision that this kind of strategy of defining democracy entails. Boland, on the other hand, argued that all operationalizations of concepts are latent and that our best indicators are causally linked to the concept because we can't directly measure the concept. And I would argue that some of our major competitors, if you'll excuse the pun here, cook a la Bolognese. That is, Freedom House operationalizes democracy on political and civil rights scores. These are things that are products of democracy, not defining characteristics of democracy. Polity does so on the basis of several indicators that are usually designed to describe the authority relations in all states, independent of regime type, that was actually defined by Eckstein. There's no dimension of democracy and autocracy in the original code book. Again, these are things that you could argue that are the products of regime rather than the defining characteristics of regime. So in this sense, I think V-Dem brings in this kind of Sartorian conceptualization in marked contrast to the major competitors. And in this sense, I would argue that that V-Dem conceptualizations are thicker in the way that Michael first advocated thick variables in his earlier methodological work. Another advantage I'd like to talk about is the modularity of the data set. That is, V-Dem is kind of a Lego set for quantitative political scientists to play around with and not only accept the things that we've done, but to create your own variables. And so it allows for the constructions of variables not included in our questionnaire, but which can be created using the data. And I'll illustrate this with something that we did in our chapter on social forces. We wanted to capture the idea of civil society social capital. And to do so, we created civil society as a kind of stock value. And we looked at how stock over time affected the three outcomes. And so in order to do this, we created a new civil society stock variable, which had to do with the participation index that we had, and then we discounted it on the basis of levels of civil society repression, which was another variable that we had put in the civil society battery. And in this way, you can see we were able to kind of gauge civil society social capital and think about that as one of the factors that affected level upturns and downturns. And we were able to, I hope, to operationalize it in a sophisticated fashion by looking at different rates of deterioration when civil society organization and participation was affected by state repression of civil society. We also have an ability in, and I think it's kind of interesting that you see things that when one looks at individual countries, one sees things that that correspond to reality on a kind of face value nature. So if you look at civil society stock in China, it's very low in the 19th century and then sort of is in mid-levels during the 20th century prior to the Chinese Revolution and then plummets precipitously. If one looks at France, one can see, peaks and valleys. The one I particularly like is it really captures the impact of the Nazi occupation experience on civil society, social capital in France. We see, interesting things in Kenya as well. We see kind of the explosion of civil society in the 1990s, which is talked about in the literature on democratization in Africa. And in the United States, of course, we see a high level of participation, but growing sort of in the post-war period, and even ticking up a little bit during the Trump years, which is in line with what we know, for instance, about protests in the United States under Trump. Another interesting advantage of the data set is the ability to drill down. One can use these indices or even the democracy indicators and understand, pull components out or add additional components and see how that affects outcomes. In Sartorian terms, this would be seen as decreasing the number of essential characteristics and expanding the extension somehow. It provides great flexibility also in fitting variables to the task in hand. So for instance, in the civil society chapter, the polyarchy measure, which we use as the main dependent variable, has this freedom of association thick component in it, and that has some of the civil society variables in it. So to avoid having the same indicator essentially on the right and left side of the regression, sorry, I just went too far there. We were able to modify the variable. That is to say, we were able to take the polyarchy variable and pull some elements out of it in order to make it suitable for regression with civil society on the independent variable side. Specifically, in another paper with Harvard Hegre and Jan Tejerel, we had created two more stripped down versions of the democracy indicator. One we called Schump, which was Schumpeterian, and this was based mostly on free and fair elections and election of all important officials. And then we also did a second one called Monk, which is based on Jerry Monk's thin conceptualization of democracy, which was Schump plus a measure of suffrage. And we regressed the civil society independent variable on these in order to avoid endogeneity problems, in order to incorporate this into the chapter. So this modularity of the data set, the ability to add and remove components of the variables created to create your new ones, we think is a great advantage, and it gives great flexibility to large N researchers. It also works very easily with other data sets. For instance, Michael noted that nonviolent movements were an important factor in upturns, and we were able to merge our data, our civil society indicators, with Erica Chenoweth's data on violent and nonviolent protest campaigns, and that really helped us eke out that finding. We were also able to combine Erica's data with some data from our colleagues on the project, Sylviane Dallam and Carl-Henrik Knudsen, on the class character of movements, and we were able to, for instance, test Wurschmeyer, Stevens, and Stevens' theory of middle sector coalition building leading to democratization. That is, when movements combining middle and working class actors tend to promote democracy very strongly. We were also able to test Lubert's theory on the interwar thesis that family farmer labor alliances promote democratization, and confirm that as well in a large N sample with a large number of observations. This is all to say that V-Dem does offer this great flexibility to create new variables, to work with old data in ways that we hope are creative. Finally, I believe that V-Dem makes novel use of expert opinion, and here I get back to sort of the mixed method mentality of the way that the data set was created. So we were able in the data set to provide point estimates of observables that are either very hard to collect or too expensive to collect. So V-Dem data collection strategy for some of our variables is based on the premise that country experts have in-depth knowledge of many aspects of politics in the country they study, which are not readily observable from easily accessible sources, but are knowable for those who've studied a place in depth, spent time in country, and read extensively about the history and politics of the country. We don't ask them to say how democratic the country is. We ask them to answer a questionnaire which will allow us to make an estimate of some fundamental properties of interest to democracy researchers. The experts do not make the judgments on aggregate measures, but only on the most fundamental elements and in ways that are much more indirect than some of the other data sets. So here's an example of a question. This was civil society participation, which played an important role in the social forces chapter. And as you see here, the expert is asked to kind of describe the involvement of people in civil society organizations, and they move from almost nothing to a kind of robust civil society along a 4-point scale running from 0 to 3. This is ordinal in the responses, but it's converted to an interval by the measurement model that we use. And it's these elements that once you have 5 people making their judgment that are then aggregated to make higher level measures like the democracy indicators. So in this sense, we're leveraging expert knowledge in ways that we believe that country experts have this unique knowledge. They can make these judgments, and then we use these to make point estimates. And because of this, I would argue that V-Dem coding is potentially less subject to coder bias driving the results. And I would argue also that it tends to minimize the problem of intercoder reliability. First, the ability of any one coder to affect the results is less than other democracy measures because we use 5. And estimation by the IRT model minimizes the impact of extreme outliers. Furthermore, the point estimates are not of democracy, but of the components used in the aggregation of higher order measures, as I showed you we did in the polyarchy indicator designed by Jan Teero. So in that sense, the compilation of the level of democracy is done ex ante by conceptualization and plugging in expert opinion, and not ex post by committees of people deciding how democratic a country is. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit when I talk about some of the competing data sets. Second, I would also argue that one relies on IRT models. Differences between coders is not a problem, but is actually meaningful information about uncertainty that is utilized in the estimation process. So in this sense, coder differences are less of a problem. They're incorporated into the model. They're seen as a sign of uncertainty, and then the model has ways of determining which of the coders should receive more weight on the basis of how they seem in comparison to the other coders. Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and Bertelsmann all use expert opinion too. EIU's experts are in-house, and our area experts who've been tracking countries for a long period of time, and they make judgments on individual indicators that are then aggregated. Freedom House resolves coder differences by using discussion sections among the people who coded the indicators ex post facto. So intercoder reliability is actually negotiated by the coders themselves after they've done their initial coding. And Polity has several people who code their indicators all in-house. Unlike the others, they're generalists, not specialists. And so in that case, coder bias could be a major problem here, which I would think is minimized by using the methods that V-Dem uses. So that's all I have on kind of the differences between our data and that of the other major competing sort of country year format, large N time series cross-national data sets. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Michael. Pipa, please.
Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed these presentations and learnt a lot from them as well. So I'm going to pick up on some of the core themes from the book and really focus in particular on what I regard as the critical challenge of our age, intellectually, in terms of politics, in terms of science, and in terms of public policy, which is the puzzle of democratic backsliding. We have had an extensive presentation, which has been really helpful to think through the broader lessons, but what does the book tell us about these issues and about what's happening in our countries today? So I'm going to focus on this by looking at, in particular, making 3 points. Firstly, I think that V-Dem is part of a much broader set of developing political indicators. And these projects have really moved forward in all sorts of ways in the last 2 decades. And it's a tremendous scientific achievement. It's unglamorous work. The number of people involved in the coding, the amount of work it takes to make it precise, the measures, making sure that it's disseminated, and everything else. It really does provide the basis of normal science. And the cross-national and time series data, as Michael Bernard just said, is really advanced. There are other ones as well. My own electoral integrity project, the corruption perception index, the World Bank's indicators, etc. But the second point I'm going to make is that in fact we're, I think, stronger at explaining levels and long-term progressive evolutions are in terms of democracy, much more than sharp democratic downturns, backsliding, and authoritarian resurgence. That remains a puzzle. And we're often, I think, trapped when we look at the decades of literature by thinking very much about the third wave era, thinking about the trends since the 1990s, and then trying to explain current developments, but they don't really fit quite a lot of the changes we've seen in many countries around the world. And thirdly, I'm going to make the point that regime stability is a product of what I'm going to term congruency. And this goes right back to Armand and Weber and some of the classics of the 1950s. And what this says is that, yes, we need to look at regime institutions, and V-Dem provides a wonderful data set to allow us to do that. But we also have to think about culture and cultural legitimation. And what is not included in the book, despite the incredibly comprehensive data set and data analysis, is anything really about political culture. Nothing about measures of regime values and principles. For example, whether people support theocracy, whether they support strongman rule, whether they do support democracy. There's little about public perceptions of formal institutions. And above all, the big gap, which I think we need to push ahead on, is to measure very much what Steve Levitsky and Dan Zimblat talked about, the informal practices, which either underpin democracy or authoritarianism. For example, justifications for the use of violence or rejection of election outcomes. And we also need to measure support for the authorities, the leaders. Now, if we can, I think, link V-Dem with some of the other types of data that we can collect, for example, for the next wave of the World Values Survey, then I think we can look at congruency, but we really need to take both levels. Now, let's just then explain what the argument is about and expand a little bit on some of these key points. V-Dem, as we've already said, and as Michael has covered, both Michaels, in fact, 450 variables, is a treasure trove. And my students, which I teach in my classes right now, really love it. That's to say the more quantitatively political economy types do. And of course, being able to disaggregate these beyond the aggregate level to the specifics. If you want to look at rule of law, if you want to look at the independent judiciary, if you want to look at parties, if you want to look at parliaments, if you want to look at human rights, all of that is available. And it's excellent to try to disentangle the complex process unfolding over a long period in widely diverse contexts. And as Michael says, what we're looking at is the level of polyarchy, annual changes, magnitudes of upturns and downturns. But I do think we also have to think about the concept, which is at the heart of what's trying to be explained and what's included and what isn't. It's Schumpeterian in its conceptual foundations. And it's, of course, about elections as the core feature, meaning electoral competition, more than one party, and an extensive suffrage, not universal necessarily, but certainly almost widespread for all adult citizens. Political and civil society organizations can operate freely. Elections are clean, and elections affect the outcome. and there's freedom of expression. So that's what we're trying to explain in the book as our core measure. So why are we better at explaining levels and progressive evolutions than sharp democratic downturns? Let's look at the actual patterns. And these are some simple descriptive graphs using V-Dem's own regime classification. And it's the number of regimes worldwide. Now, the number of regimes obviously increases over time because of independence and the decolonization. And this is the long sweep of history. This is 1900 to the most recent wave. And immediately one can see the big trends during the third wave, which is so familiar. I won't go into those. Huntington's idea of advances and retreats. But let's just focus on the era in the last 2 decades. And immediately we can see the core challenge which needs to be explained most recently, which is the countries which are seen as full autocracies, Saudi Arabia's, countries without effective clean elections and competition, Myanmar under the military, Egypt arguably under that category as well, and the liberal democracies, the dark green, which goes down. Does it go down a lot? Not in the V-Dem data, but nevertheless, as Michael also alluded to, Freedom House and the Economist Unit and all the others agree that there has been some decline in the most long-standing liberal democracies of the world. The United States is not alone in this. Clearly, many other cases have seen that. So that's what we're trying to explain in the most recent era. And again, let's disaggregate this a little bit so we can see which countries we're talking about. And immediately it starts to make much more sense. This is the net change in democracy and economic development during the most recent era of the 21st century, the last 2 decades. And the countries which jump out show the patterns that you would expect. So if we just look across the bottom, here we have countries which have a net loss in the Liberal Democracy Index just between 2000 and 2021, without taking account of any volatility. And of course, it's Hungary under Viktor Orban. It's Poland under Law and Justice. It's Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega. It's Turkey under Erdogan. It's Thailand after a military coup d'etat. India under Modi. Benin after a military intervention in what had been otherwise a success story in Africa. Brazil under Bolsonaro. Mauritius, El Salvador, Botswana. The United States is there, of course. It has gone down, not as much as the most extreme countries with authoritarian populists, Greece and some others. And then, of course, some countries, according to this net change, have gone up. It's not all a single direction. And what you can also see is that it's not at all related essentially to changes in the economy. That's on the vertical axis, that's pretty flat. There are some countries which have got more affluent in this period. Some countries have become poorer, but there's no clear relationship. And again, just to summarize what we're trying to explain and focus on this, because I don't think any of the presentations so far have talked about specific cases. And those cases tell us something about the patterns. It's not simply about running a model, it's also talking about the outliers. And here what we have is a measure of stability in the Liberal Democracy Index, again in the same period, the last 2 decades, worldwide. And what you have is simply the level, which is the mean across this era, and then the variations, which are the standard deviation, which is the vertical axis. And this shows us again the countries which have dramatically changed. Again, of course, the Hungary, the Polands, the Brazils, in terms of those which are moderately high and yet have had tremendous fluctuations. Tunisia, of course, in that case, Turkey, Nepal, Armenia, Maldives, Afghanistan, of course, Venezuela, of course, Libya. And that tells us something about the story that we need to look for in the data. It's not simply looking back at the classics. It is also thinking ahead about the cases and going up and down the theoretical model. So one looks at the cases to try to theorize about them, and you look at the theories to see how far they fit the cases. And of course, at the bottom of the graph, you have the cases which are the most stable, the North Koreas of the world, in terms of a standard authoritarian, and Norway in terms of the standard democracies, and many other in the middle. And again, it's a slight curvilinear pattern. So it's the countries in the middle of liberal democracies, the countries which are transitional, which have gone up and down most, and the countries which are most democratic or most authoritarian, the most stable. So what explains the last 20 years? What explains democratic backsliding? Is it geography? Clearly not. You can't explain fixed conditions or demography, which can be altered somewhat, but nevertheless is a largely stable characteristics. International forces, that's part of the explanation. And that's part of broadly the field of international relations, the weakening of human rights, the weakening of the United Nations, and the weakening of the United States, I'd argue, is very much part of this, but it's clearly not the whole story, nor is the rise of China or the rise of Russia, although again, that's part of the story. Economic conditions, political institutions, civil society and social forces, do they explain it? Well, let's look at the book. And as Michael already alluded to, he looked at levels, and this looks at changes. This is the path diagram, which summarizes, would you believe, 6 pages in the book, which are a table, which my editor would normally say is far too long a table, even though I love tables myself. But this shows us the path diagram of determinants of the downturns in polyarchy. And what I want all of us to think about is, are the explanations which Michael put forward about the factors which are the best predictors of downturn in polyarchy, that's to say downturn in electoral democracies, do they fit the cases that we have just started to highlight? Is there, in other words, some plausibility between the theoretical argument which is being presented and the cases that we're often very familiar with? Or what else is not included? And of course, no book can explain everything, but it has to be said that some of the factors which are included as powerful explanations for downturns in general over the long period may make sense during the whole period from 1900 onwards, but do they actually make sense in more recent eras? So participatory CSOs, civic society, it should be vibrant in order to fight back, to have mass mobilization, to challenge the executive if they try to have too much power and try to weaken rule of law, yes. But of course, CSOs are part of the measure of electoral democracy. So is there circularity going on there? Anti-system movements, do they lead to downturns? Mass protests, movements which are anti-democratic in their philosophy? Well, obviously, yes. On the other hand, does this really give us much purchase power? Which explanation of the downturn and backsliding would not have, for example, in America, MAGA, or in countries like Germany, the AfD, or in Italy, the current developments with the Brotherhood and the Lega. And it's left-wing movements in the model which are seen as most powerful, not the right-wing movements which have been so predominant in the last 2 decades. So again, take a different period, and we might find a very different pattern. At present, left-wing movements are not a strong part, I'd argue, of the anti-fascist, anti-system movement, though they have been in the past. Strict presidentialism, yes, that's important. But where's the role of authoritarian populism? It's not discussed. Where's the role of actors, particular individual leaders who have been clearly at the forefront of this? It's not simply the presidential office. It's the fact that those leaders have chosen to try to press on the limits on executive power. And the parties have gone along with them. And these are institutionalized parties. These are parties which are often long-standing, if you think about many of these. Where's the role of electoral systems in this model? Where's the role of independent legislatures? So clearly, I'm not attacking the model, I'm not criticizing it directly, but I am saying that when we take our familiar cases in the recent decades, we try to explain them by the long-term patterns, we need to think harder. We need to have new theories. We need to have better arguments for what's going on. And as the book itself says in the very first chapter, there are very few robust findings on the determinants of democratic decline. Even after several decades, researchers are far from reaching any full understanding or consensus on why affluent, long-standing democracies, which have got strong civil societies, which have got strong institutionalized parties, and which have the other criteria which are part of that model, why they clearly are going backwards in their levels of democracy. And we do need to understand the advances are different to setbacks. So quickly, just the third point, which I'm going to make, which is we need to bring in culture. Now, you might say I would do that, but I do a balance between studying institutions and culture. And I'm going to argue that what we need to do is use more mixed methods. Michael emphasized that that's important, but nowadays we do have the incredible resources of the World Value Survey, European Value Survey. These are the coverage worldwide from the very beginning through to the most recent wave, the 7th wave. And we're really good on many of the countries which are backsliding. This is what the country coverage in the World Value Survey looks like if we break it down by the V-Dem regime classification. So does it include a lot of liberal democracies and electoral democracies? It does. And of course, some of those have changed. This is a classification based on the 7th wave, where the regime is right now. And we know that over time, we've captured a lot of the dynamics of regimes. At the same time, we also include many electoral autocracies. We've been expanding that. And we are also including, and have long included, many absolute autocracies. So what do we need to measure? Well, I argue that in the 8th wave, which we're just starting to plan, we need to move from the standard measures. Many of the surveys are focused on democracy. It's a bias which is there, which is reflected even in, I think, the title of the book. Autocracy is not simply the antithesis of democracy. It's not simply the absence of democracy. It's something else in its own right. We're always asking people about how important is it to live in a country that's governed democratically, and how is the performance working? But that is a question that cues people because it has the big D in the question. And we need to move from that to some other measures. So we do also have in the World Value Survey and in other surveys like the global barometers, measures of regime preferences. For example, having a strong leader. Nothing refers to a democracy about that. Having experts or a technocracy, having the army rule, and having theocracy, which we can ask in countries which we did, like Iran. But again, these are limited because they're not really about many of the developments which I think are going on when we come to backsliding. We've got classic measures of authoritarian values, but they're from social psychology, but even though they often work when you look at a number of different social psychological studies, nevertheless, understanding what they mean is really complicated, and they're not necessarily transparent what they're measuring. So the next to last slide, what do we need to measure? And here I come back to thinking about what are the changes that we're most observing in the United States, but in many other countries, in the United Kingdom, in Hungary, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and so on. And I come back to what Steve and Daniel talk about when they talk about informal norms and practices. It's not that the formal structure has changed necessarily. It's instead attitudes and tolerance of a variety of authoritarian practices. And we need to measure that systematically in the next wave of the World Value Survey. And then I think look backwards and say, how far does a culture which is supporting these authoritarian informal norms and practices, how far does that actually predict the institutional changes which are revealed by the V-Dem measures? And again, I'll show the ones which I've just thought of. We haven't yet decided any of these. We're still in the initial stages of discussing this. The 8th wave of the World Value Survey starts in January 2024. So we have more than a year to get the battery correct. And I'd really welcome everybody's participation and thoughts about whether these are the sort of things that we need to measure. But certainly questions like, it's important that leaders respect the results of elections. Do you approve or disapprove of this? Do you disapprove or approve of parties advocating violence should be banned? Sometimes it's okay to disobey the law if it's morally wrong. The government should regulate the publication of radical views which threaten our country. The authorities should prevent teaching in schools which spread hatred. It's more important to maintain security, even if that restricts the ability to protest peacefully. So all of these are the sort of things which I think are very much up for discussion. I think we need to really measure authoritarian culture and support for authoritarian leaders, support for authoritarian practices and institutions, and support for authoritarian values and principles. And just to end, I will say that we're so focused on democracy in our world, as scholars. We're focused on it as citizens as well. And we're focused on this because in some ways it's familiar. In other words, it's rather like Simone de Beauvoir when she talked about how we understand the sexes. And a large part of what we understand is we have a model of men, and then we say, well, women are the other. Women are not men. Women do not have these characteristics. Women do not have these behavioral aspects. Similarly, when we think about democracy, we're familiar with democracy. We know how it works. We have 60 years or more of literature that we draw upon. The third wave expanded that literature. And so that gives us an intellectual rigidity, if you like, about how we understand the world. But I'm not sure that it's really that suitable for understanding the other, for understanding why, according to the polls, Russians supported the war of Ukraine. We're not very effective at understanding those who are turning out to demonstrate in favor of the regimes. We're not very good at understanding how far there is any form of genuine legitimacy in authoritarian regimes. There are some new books which are starting to come out on popular dictatorships and understanding how we can think about legitimacy in authoritarian regimes. But I think that, combined with V-Dem, would for me be a really exciting new agenda. I'm only starting to work on this with a new book. My new book is called The Cultural Roots of Authoritarian Legitimacy. But I think it's an area which really is deserving. And again, kudos to V-Dem, a tremendous resource. I love the data. If it didn't exist, we'd have to make it. Somebody would have to produce it. And I don't want to produce it. So thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to all the team and Stefan and all the experts. And really, I welcome thoughts and ideas and where we go from here to understand the challenges of our time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Pippa and Michael. Really it's given us a lot to think about. We have about 20 minutes, I guess, for discussion. The audience has been patiently sitting here, so I'm sure people have questions and reactions. And so what I want to do is collect a few questions and then and I have some questions of my own, but as I'm sort of filibustering here, I hope people are collecting their thoughts, and then we'll send it back to Michael for responses, both to Pippa's great comments as well as the audience's. And then you guys can choose which comments to respond to. Yes, Natasha.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah.
So Natasha Wunsch, I'm a visiting scholar here at CS, and thank you for the really excellent and insightful presentation. I have two questions to Michael Kovic, and then one to Pippa. I really like the idea of kind of looking at these big trends within the V-Dem data, and kind of teasing out these differences. I think that at one point the project was called sequences of success and failed and successful sequences of democratization. So it already intrigued me back then when you got the money results. I'm wondering, when you look at the pathways, and Pippa alluded to kind of bringing countries in, are the different causal pathways that you identify, in particular for polyarchy, are they exclusive to individual countries, or are outcomes sometimes overdetermined? So you'll have kind of different pathways leading to the same outcome for any given country. Is this something that you looked at all? And the second question is about kind of methodologically, and Michael Barnett made a point about taking out some of the indicators out of the polyarchy in order to put put specific indicators into on the independent and dependent variable side, because what struck me is that in particular about the civil society association, that seemed to be an independent variable, but then it's also part of the polyarchy index. So how do you deal with that when you're running regressions to see these bigger trends? And then to Pippa, I think it's really great. I'm working myself on a book project that looks at political cultures. I'm hoping we can meet while I'm here. And one thing I was wondering is, I'm familiar with Chris Welzel's and so on work on the authoritarian attitudes. Are you thinking of going beyond this simple dichotomy of democratic and authoritarian to also look at other conceptions? And particularly in my book, I look at majoritarian conceptions, but also instrumental ones, kind of making it a little bit broader than just this dichotomy. Thank you.
Okay, great. Again, what we'll do is just collect some questions before turning back to speakers. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, Steve Hansen, William and Mary, and visiting scholar, CES for the year. Thanks for the wonderful panel. I guess I have one question for the Michaels and one for Professor Norris. On the V-Dem project, I was interested in this problem of theory and kind of how we go back to grand theory, modernization theory, or others to figure out how this data set would help us adjudicate those bigger questions we used to ask in the field, but largely stopped in favor of more inductive work. And I wonder in particular if it could be the case that even the expert methodology could be affected by our current atheoretical moment. What I mean by that is there's a tendency, certainly my own area of expertise, which is Russian studies, for a lot of people to believe the same things about regimes at a certain moment, and then suddenly even the experts, to be shocked by a change that occurs. And so if that's right, and none of us have a theory, the danger is you're going to get a reflection each time you ask these questions of the experts of the current kind of uninformed theoretical status quo. So that would be kind of a problem, I think, for the aggregation and robustness of the work, although it is incredible. For Pippa Norris, though, I did want to ask about culture and time, because if we're really looking at the last 20 years, just quickly, I don't quite see how changes in culture, which we would typically think of as intergenerational,
Right.
possibly change fast enough in 20 years to explain these results.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was putting myself in queue.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I think you were next.
That's okay.
I don't, yeah.
Laurel Weldon,
Yeah, yeah.
visiting scholar, Center for European Studies. Great to be here. Thank you for these amazing presentations, and thank you for the V-Dem data, which I've been very lucky to use. And I will say Pippa helped me figure out how important and valuable it was in a particular project that I was working on. So thank you very much. My question was a little bit, I think this is a little bit like what Natasha was asking maybe, which is that I really am intrigued also by this question about decline and the diagram that Pippa zeroed in on. I'm also interested in your question about the protective belt. And what I'm wondering, can you say a bit more about what you see as being the kind of mechanisms by which these relationships occur? So you're saying that, for example, the civil society organizations and the parties work together to provide a protective belt. And the third item, how is it that you think that they are providing this protective belt? So if I think about civil society organizations as being kind of a rich environment, and then I think that MAGA kind of organizations are a threat, I'm not understanding. Those sound like, I'm not sure exactly how it is that you think that protective belt is working. So I'm interested in knowing if you can tell me a little bit more about what's going on in that relationship in your view.
Right.
Okay, well, you guys have more than enough questions already, but let's just put the final ones on the table here. Grzegorz.
Okay, a very quick question. I was looking at those different diagrams, graphs and so on, and what I saw were usual suspects. These are the things we learn, in graduate schools, that this set of variables influences democratization. Have you discovered anything which kind of goes against what we know? Did the data generate some completely new finding or completely new arguments, completely new ideas? I would be, very curious about that.
And I'm going to have to ask a couple of my questions of myself. So again, choose to answer these or whichever one you want to ask, and then we'll turn it back to you. So one question, I guess it's a methodological question, which is in terms of these three outcomes of levels, surges, and downturns. So you're treating these as three different outcomes, but of course, levels are a product of previous surges and downturns. And so, if one's explaining a level, let's say in 1950, presumably this is the result of a surge and a downturn. So how does one sort of navigate that? I mean, I'm not challenging it as much as just puzzling over how to think about conceptually, how do these things relate? That's one question. A second question, just to I think echo Steve's question, I sort of wondered, this is a more fundamental question about V-Dem, I guess. You're assessing expert opinion wrong or right, right? And whether the expert opinion is wrong or right. And so I just wonder how you think about that. Well, just in the sense that the level of civil society in a country, experts have some kind of, you're measuring the consensus of experts, but the experts may not be correct. right? And so I mean, I'm not sure how does one get out of that bind if all of the experts, you're measuring the consensus or, you know, the degree of consensus. And I know there's uncertainty around this, around, you know, if experts disagree with each other. But if experts, you know, how do you think about that? And actually, I mean, kind of a related point. So when you're testing Ruschmeyer, Stevens and Lubert and so on, I know if I were an expert asked about like 1920s Italy, my impression of how I would code Italy comes from my reading of Lubert and Ruschmeyer, Stevens. So, you know, so how does one separate out the testing of the theory? There's a kind of self-reflect or a kind of reflective thing where it's in a hall of mirrors at some level. I mean, how does one get out of that kind of bind? And then a final question for Pippa. So I'm wondering, so I, you know, appreciate the incorporation of norms and so on. I'm wondering if you've thought about whether to treat these kinds of informal norms themselves. I mean, in a way, the way you presented it is on the independent variable side of the story. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also wonder to what degree can one think of these norms as being part of the institutions? I mean, institutional norms are themselves, I mean, should this be part of our conceptualization of democracy, in fact, whether or not people accept elections? You know, I understand that gets messy if we're talking about mass opinion that maybe shouldn't be part of the outcome, but how is there a way to think about norms as being part of the outcome? And also it's similarly for V-Dem, how would, you know, could one ever incorporate that, this kind of softer side of institutions?
Right.
Okay, so you guys again have more than enough on the table. So maybe I'll start with you, Michael. We have about 10 minutes left. So
Oh, I should probably have this microphone here. Do I need to press a button?
I think it's on. Yeah. Oops, there you
No,
go.
I just turned it back on. Okay. Thank you for being a great audience and asking really tough questions. No, respond to Pippa first. Pippa, I don't disagree with anything you said. I think that entirely on point. I would say that you know, you're right. Levels are better explained than upturns and downturns. I think that's because levels are easier to explain than upturns and downturns because they're more stable. There's less variance there, and things that are more dynamic are inherently harder to explain. And also, I wanted to acknowledge the limitations of what we're doing in this particular book. First off, is that there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about the specification, like what are the variables and how do they fit together. And for that reason, we present this chapter as more of a theory development chapter than a testing chapter of it. It's developing theory based on a lot of previous theorizing, a lot of case studies, a lot of area knowledge, and a lot of testing with now even more data than we've ever had before. So it's particularly well-informed theory development. It's also let me see. It's also unclear in many cases about what the causal mechanisms are. Like we can see the empirical relationships and we can't be fine-grained enough to examine all of the causal mechanisms. So we have to kind of speculate about what's going on. Although I think it is a step forward, it is some progress in that specifying some causal sequences is addressing in a very general way what some of the grand causal mechanisms are there. But in particular to two of your points, like I readily admit that because we're looking at average relationships over a huge sample, we're overlooking some of the very likely causal heterogeneity that's going on. And so our models fit this really large history at the expense of having a more specific explanation for trends in the last 20 years. And if we focused on the last 20 years, certainly the story would be somewhat different.
Right.
We would probably have some different explanations for the rise of authoritarian populism around the world. And then to another really good point is about omitted variables. There are some variables that we could not measure over this huge sample of a long period of time and had to leave out of our model. And probably the most important, well, two of the most important kinds of variables are cultural variables coming from survey data because people weren't doing surveys very much before 1950. Uh, and also information about leadership, what particular leaders are doing. And so what's the role of leaders who are elected, but especially autocrats. And we haven't incorporated that in this study. So in turn, I applaud any effort to gather more and better data about measuring culture better. And I love all of the indicators that you're sketching out in your slide. I think these are wonderful questions to be asking, and I think they would be better than things that World Value Survey has been asking up to now. Of course, there's a trade-off there. You know, if we rely on that kind of data, we have to limit a sample that we're including to the present and the future. And we don't have those questions to study the past. And so it's difficult to find a way to combine those things. However, I think there may be some other data in V-Dem that we have not used here that we could use in the future to get at some of these questions. We have some data about regime legitimation, like what are the legitimation formulas that regimes tend to rely on. So we have some data about that from a spin-off project. We also have some data on polarization that come from our civic and academic society indicators. We also have some data from the B-Party spinoff that's at the level of political parties that measure to what degree are the major political parties illiberal and populist. And we don't have that going all the way back, but we could be using that.
Do you have, are there data on disputed elections, or whether there's an opposition that challenges the legitimacy of elections? That's a kind of behavioral indicator that one could.
Well, yeah,
right?
we have that in our main data set.
Yeah, okay.
There's a data about whether losers accepted the election outcome.
Yeah, good.
That's a graded indicator. So, I mean, there are other things I could say, but I should address some of the other comments as well. Well, for Natasha, if I understand the question right, these pathways, are they for specific countries or are they more general than that? And I would say what we're estimating here are the average tendencies in a very huge sample. So it may be that there is no particular country that follows exactly that pathway, but on average, for a huge sample, these are significant tendencies. Steve Hansen, it's always a danger that all of the experts that we consult are subject to the same biases. And if that is going on, then our data will be biased too. How do we guard against that? I mean, it's possible that's going on because experts do get caught flat-footed by major changes in world history, like the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so our data are always a little bit behind. When we do updates every year, we give experts the chance to update the ratings that they supplied in previous iterations of the sample. So if they've learned something about what was going on that they weren't aware of at the time, then they can change their scores, and the new version, each successive new version of the data should be a little bit more accurate, have a little more hindsight built into it. And there was another question that was addressed in that way. Your question.
Same question. So you don't
Well,
need to
similar
address it.
question.
But
About the shared bias.
Yeah.
We have done some validation exercise to look at this. Especially for the corruption data, which is probably one of the things that people would be most skeptical about, like how do we know how corrupt this inherently hidden activity is? We've done some validation by asking whether the characteristics of our country coders are associated with the ratings that they assign. And the answer is, for the most part, no. It's not associated to, a little bit with gender, but not a whole lot.
They all went to University of Chicago. They have one.
Yeah, those things, like all those, like how much education they have, what country they're in, where they studied, those kinds of things don't predict their ratings very well.
You could imagine that actually the greater the, at first glance, you would think the greater the consensus, the more confident you could be in the findings. But in a certain way, I could also imagine that the greater the
Could be
variation,
groupthink.
it could, yeah, there's this, you sort of have certain, and there's a certain strength in that.
It could
right?
be.
Yeah.
Could be. Another kind of validation, Kelly McMahon did this. She wanted to find some people to replicate, well, not to replicate, but to provide some alternative ratings to check this, people who weren't aware, who didn't know much about political history and had not seen V-Dem data before. So she recruited some bright undergraduates to look at other sources of information to assess how corrupt governments were at different points of time for a selection of countries. And so she had them like trace patterns of how corruption rose and fell in certain countries over the years, and found that there was substantial agreement between what they came up with and what our data was showing about these things. So, I mean, I've been pretty happy with the validation exercises that we've done so far, and I'm reassured by that. So Laura Weldon, what are the mechanisms in this protective belt? How does it work? Well, you know, we don't know. This has to be speculation, but what I'm imagining is that, for example, if the rule of law begins to suffer, like if there are attacks on the independence of the courts and things like that, then civil society may mobilize and protest this, and maybe through a course of influencing elections and replacing people in power, that they may bring different governments into power that have more respect for an independent judiciary, or political institutionalized parties may have an interest in making sure that they're not undermined by biased courts. Or if there are political parties that start to act in authoritarian ways and do things like, I mean, I won't name names here, but then maybe the courts can step in and start prosecuting people. So these things, I think, interact with each other, and that they help correct one another and help maintain the status quo, help bring the other actors in the system back into line with the system. That's how I'm imagining, but that, you know, it's speculation. And so I think that's a hypothesis that could be tested with other means, especially really good case studies.
So Michael, I think since we're at
Okay,
the end
I
of our
should stop.
hour, although
I'll stop.
yeah, so maybe just to give final word to Michael and Pippa, if you each want to say something brief. We are out of time, so just, but want to give you guys each. So Michael Bernhard, do you want to say something? You're on mute. You're on mute, Michael. Oh. Michael, you're on mute.
First to Pippa, thank you for those generous comments. I think the critiques are valid, and I like where you're going with the next round in terms of gauging authoritarian and democratic attitudes by asking those questions and rather directly asking the question. I think that's great. I think the bias question has been answered mostly, but I would say we're not asking people to address the state of any particular, like whether something is democratic or authoritarian, or whether it's stable or unstable. The level of the questions are much closer to the ground. And then the work of figuring out higher level indicators is done by the aggregation, which is conceptual. So I think that is some assurance that I don't know, mass coder delusion is driving the results. But you know, if everybody's wrong, we do have garbage in, garbage out. That's true. I wanted to respond to Laurel's question on what are the mechanisms. I've done some work on this. There's actually a paper I did with Stefan Lindberg, Alan Hicken, and Chris Renock on democratic survival, and we found both that institutionalized party systems and robust civil society protected countries against democratic breakdown. There was also a book by Scanning, Muller, and Cornell that looked at the interwar period, found very much the same thing. And my theoretical understanding is that it's the question of accountability, and it is increasing the costs. So if you think of democracy as a self-regulating equilibrium where actors sanction each other to prevent them from defecting from the rules of the democratic game, then that would seem to be the mechanism, and that's what we argue in that paper. Michael pointed out we are getting more cultural variables in there. So I was involved in the creation of the battery to think about the dominant mode that the state uses to legitimize itself. That's in there. There's also new data on movements, whether movements are pro-democratic or pro-authoritarian. And hopefully there'll be a paper coming out of an R&R on that. And again, we're showing that the character of movements plays an important effect on both changes in level and also in breakdown or survival. So there is new data there. And to Jay Gorge's question, is this the usual suspects? I'm going to say the following, Jay Gorge. You and I have spent our academic lives, studying the same old gray lady, civil society. And on some level, we are able to finally integrate that into large N models and show the important kind of mechanistic relationships that you and I have spent our life studying at the country level are really important on the aggregate level. And what we observe in some very important cases is true at large. And I think that is an important recalibration of the literature on what causes democratic breakdown, democratic downturn, democratic survival. And I think the path models that Michael and colleagues did in the last chapter are a major contribution in showing how the ignoring of that dimension is something that's been a limitation of what how we've studied democratic and authoritarian regime change up to that point. And I'm going to stop because I know we're well over time now.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. I think we are going to stop there. Pippa, I know I said I'd give you a last word, but I think you've had your word. My job today was to keep the trains running on time, and I failed. Everybody else did a spectacular job, including our audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.